Welcome to Tuesday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us again today, and we're going to continue in our series entitled No Doubts. I want you to go in your Bibles today. We're going to be over there in just a few minutes to Numbers chapter 13. Numbers, the 13th chapter. We're going to see another example today of people who dealt with doubt and unbelief. In fact, we've already picked up some before. You know, God has included in His Word just a whole bunch of examples for us, for our benefit, of the good, the bad, and the ugly of faith, and people who are just riddled with doubts. Now, we've already talked about Peter, the disciples, about Abraham, and we've seen how they worked through the doubts and the unbelief, and they came to a place of great faith. We see what caused those doubts and unbelief in their life. And again, God uses those and writes those, puts them in the Word for our example, so we don't have to go through the same thing that they did and the same struggles that they did. We can see where they messed it, where they corrected things, and of course, how to correct those in our life. Doubts and unbelief can be done away with, but it's all a matter of directing our faith toward the right thing. In fact, really, doubts and unbelief are misdirected faith. They're faith directed and focused on things, other than God, whether it be this natural realm, whether it be ourselves, whether it be other men or man-made institutions, whatever, anything other than God. If we focus any of our faith on anything other than God and what He said in His Word, we're going to have doubts and unbelief somewhere along the way. Now, here in Numbers chapter 13, this is a story here. I'll just give you a real quick background. Most everybody, if you don't know this story, you've probably seen the Ten Commandments at some point in time. You know, in those 3 or 4 hours on that movie, they cover a large expanse of time there and what events had happened. But this is about the children of Israel. They were, of course, in bondage in Egypt. They were in slavery there for hundreds of years. In fact, it got really bitter and bad toward the end. There was a Pharaoh that came to power and just totally forgot about Joseph and what he did, and what he did to really prosper that nation, that kingdom. And so they began to hold them in slavery, basically out of fear. And they were in bitter bondage there. And of course, they were covenant people. They were God's covenant people. They were the natural seed of Abraham. They began to cry out to God. God raised up Moses, the deliverer. And then God delivered them supernaturally, miraculously, out of that bitter bondage of Egypt. Now, Egypt was one of the strongest economies and the strongest military kingdoms in the world at that time. Maybe the largest, maybe the strongest, maybe the greatest at that time. And yet God, without any natural man-made help, delivered the children of Israel out from the bondage of Egypt. And of course, we know about the 10 plagues and how the last one really did Pharaoh in. And they ate, the children of Israel ate the Passover lamb, and then Egypt let them go the next day. They left Egypt, they left the bondage of Egypt, and they headed out to where God intended for them to go, which is the promised land that He had promised Abraham hundreds of years before that in the covenant. And of course, in their route, they got to the Red Sea, and it looks like that's an impossible situation. There wasn't a bridge there, there wasn't ferry boats or anything like that. There was a Red Sea in front of them, and then all of a sudden, Pharaoh, in his hardness of heart, he said, you know what, I think I'm going to go get them back, because I don't know how we're going to do what we want to do without them. So he sent his chariots out there, all the armies of Egypt, again, the greatest, strongest army in the world at that time, and they were going to bring them back. And so Israel was facing the Red Sea. They had Pharaoh's army and chariots breathing down their neck. And then God did something impossible again for them. He parted the Red Sea right in front of them. That is one of the greatest, most spectacular miracles ever witnessed by any human being in all the history of mankind. And they walked across on dry ground. They got to the other side. God had been holding the armies of Egypt back with that pillar of fire. He relinquished that. He withdrew that, and the armies of Egypt went chasing after the children of Israel through the Red Sea. And we know the story how God just allowed that Red Sea to go back where it was and just swallowed them up. They all drowned there in that Red Sea. And this all happened right in front of the children of Israel. And then they get out in the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And they got hungry and thirsty out there in the middle of nowhere. There weren't restaurants. There wasn't Hamburger Boulevard there. So God supernaturally, miraculously provided for them. He brought water out of a rock. Water out of a rock. Split a rock. Water came gushing out and gave water to all the children of Israel out there in the middle of nowhere. Then he brought quail in. They ate till it was coming out their nose. Then he brought manna down out of heaven. They ate that for 40 years, it turned out, so it must have been pretty good. In fact, it must have been better than, Krispy Kreme donuts with a hot sign on or something like that. But, that manna came down every day, and they gathered that, ate that every day, but the Sabbath day. So supernaturally, God was showing his faithfulness and his ability to sustain them and deliver them. And a lot of people think, well, I'll tell you what, if I could just see a miracle, if I could just see something spectacular, boy, it'd just help my faith. It'd get rid of doubts and unbelief. I want you to see right there, it didn't do anything for them. It didn't help their faith at all. They saw some of the greatest, most spectacular miracles in the history of mankind, all in that one generation, that one span of time, and yet it didn't help their faith at all. In fact, they went through the wilderness. They got on the edge of their promised land, the land that God promised to their forefathers, and how God was giving them that land in the covenant. And they were on the edge of going in and possessing that land. And I can tell you, there's some things that you're just not going to possess. There's some promises you're not going to receive. There's some God's best you're just not going to be able to possess and live in without exercising faith on your own. And of course, this all caught up with them here at the edge of the promised land. And so we're going to pick it up here in verse number 1. Numbers chapter 13, verse number 1. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them." So notice what was about to happen. They were on the edge, about to go into the promised land. And God said, I want you to send spies, one spy from each tribe into the promised land. And I want you to bring back the report from that land to the rest of the children of Israel out there in the wilderness. And then, so they went in and they spent a number of days in there. But I want you to point out, you can just read that. In fact, I encourage you to read Numbers 13 on your own. We don't have time here in our limited amount of time here in this podcast. But verse 23, it says, "Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there they cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they carried it between two of them on a pole. And they also brought some of the pomegranates and the figs." Now I want you to see right here, this was not just any land that we're talking about. This was the best land. In fact, it took two guys with a pole in the middle to bring back one cluster of grapes. Now, I tell you what, I've been to a lot of farmers markets. We used to have grapes growing up, a vineyard back in our backyard. I never saw anything like that, where it was so big you had to have two guys to carry it inside. No, I tell you, this is a land like none other. God's hand was on God's best. This was God's best. God always reserves his best for his people, for his covenant people. Not just enough, not just good enough, but the best. God always is thinking about the best for us. And so they brought this back, and then we're going to pick it up in verse 26. "And now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran and at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land." So they showed them that cluster of grapes, the pomegranates, the figs, all the produce that they'd come back with. Then verse 27, "Then they told him and said, We went to the land that you sent us, and it truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." In other words, that's what God said. He said, I'm giving you a land that flows with milk and honey. And he said, truly it does. In other words, God's right about that. They should have stopped right there, okay? But I want you to notice in verse 28, it says, "Nevertheless, uh-oh, things are fixing to turn bad here. Bad to ugly. It says, nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Verse 29, the Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. Verse 30, then Caleb quieted the people before Moses. What does that tell us right there? What does that tell us? That means they're in an uproar right now. They didn't see the produce. They didn't listen to the fact that God's truly said is a land that flows with milk and honey. They listened to this unbelief. You know why? Because they had a heart open to unbelief and doubts right here. And they began to describe the walled cities, the giants, they gave them a bad report right here. These spies gave a bad report. Now 10 of them did. 10 of the 12 came back with a bad report, a report of unbelief. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, they came back with a good report. That's who's talking right here. Caleb is one of those spies that came back with a good report. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we're well able to overcome it. Now, they saw the same thing that the other 10 spies did. They weren't sent to a remote part of Canaan land, the promised land somewhere where they didn't see anything but pastures and cows. And then they came back and said, well, we can just go ahead and do a little cow tipping and we can go possess the land. No, they saw the same exact thing that the other spies did. See, it's not what you see, it's how you see it. It's your perspective of things. It's how you're viewing things. See, the other 10 spies and the rest of the children of Israel saw through the perspective of self-centeredness, self-focused, self-aware. In other words, they saw walled cities they couldn't overcome. They saw giants that were bigger than them. And they looked at that in comparison with themselves to the obstacles, the challenges in going in and possessing that land. They came to the conclusion that we just can't do this. You know why? Because they forgot God. They lost sight of God. They lost focus. Where was God in their conversation? It was nowhere. It was all about them and what they could do, and they determined they weren't tall enough, they weren't big enough, they weren't mighty enough to overcome the giants and the walled cities. But you know what? Caleb said, we're well able to overcome it. Why? Because perspective. They saw God in the center. They weren't comparing themselves with the obstacles, with the challenges, with the problems there. They were comparing those giants, those walled cities, with God. And they came to the conclusion, I tell you what, this is nothing for God. God's a lot bigger than them. He's a lot more strong. He's a lot stronger than them. We just were delivered out of Egypt. They forgot all about this. They were just delivered out of Egypt. And all the great armies of Egypt, they were delivered out without them having to lift a finger hardly. They just left with silver and gold. I mean, they paid them to leave. They got to the Red Sea, and God in his mighty hand blew that whole Red Sea and parted it. I tell you what, they were remembering God, and they said, you know what, this is nothing. This is not anywhere close to what we just came out of. God, by his mighty hand, delivered us out of. And that's why Caleb said, we're well able to overcome it. Verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, we're not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. Notice that. They forgot God. They're stronger than we. Yeah, but they weren't stronger than God. Perspective. Verse 32, and they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which they have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. Verse 33, there we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. And I've got to stop right there. We're out of time for today, but there is something there at the end that it produces doubt and unbelief. We're going to uproot and get rid of with the new covenant realities. Join us again tomorrow. If you like additional resources and materials, go to tonycowan.org. We will see you tomorrow.